Feyzi Baban earned an MA in political science at Bogazici University in Turkey, and then went on to complete his PhD at Carleton University in Canada. He has remained in Canada at Trent University since then, writing an extensive series of articles on the situation of Turkish migrants in Germany and other countries, and more recently on Syrian and other migrants living in Turkey. Suzan Ilcan graduated from a series of Canadian universities, culminating in her PhD from Carleton, where she came into contact with Dr. Baban and began publishing in the late 1990s a series of papers on poverty, development, and migrants. As a professor at the University of Windsor in Canada, she has secured an impressive series of extramural research grants to sustain her work with several colleagues. Kim Rygiel completed her PhD in political science at York University. After a postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster University, she joined the Department of Politics at Trent University before moving on to the Wilfrid Laurier University, where she is Associate Director of the International Migration Research Center. She has published 3 books on migrants and their path to citizenship in different societies. This article gives us an insightful look into the situation of millions of people driven out of Syria by the unbelievable violence of the Syrian government against its own citizens. While that situation continues to evolve and the number of displaced persons continues to increase, this snapshot of the tragedy presents features of the migrant situation that remain important to understand.
Syrian refugees in Turkey in a more familiar perspective, first note that the population of Syria in 2011 was just over 21 million people, almost exactly the same as the population of Florida in 2017. It was in 2011 that the simmering tensions in Syria erupted into systematic, countrywide violence. For our Florida scenario, imagine that a minority group within the population had control of the office of the governor, and that the governor had declared broad emergency powers to deal with unrest and terrorism in the state, mobilizing the state's National Guard troops and state police to keep order. When protesters gathered in various places around the state, from Miami to Tallahassee, they were met with tear gas, clubs, fire hoses, and eventually live fire from automatic weapons, and hundreds of people were killed by the troops and police during peaceful protests. Some of the survivors of these protests then got together, along with the guns they'd acquired with their Second Amendment rights, and formed militias. More violent clashes occurred, this time with some of the National Guard troops being killed, along with many more protesters. Some of the National Guard troops began to go over to the side of the protesters, and the violence continued to escalate. Governor Assad then called in airstrikes on neighborhoods in Miami and Tampa, where the protesters set up local self-defense councils and tried to organize an alternative government. Ordinary Floridians caught up in this violence began to be killed in some of the airstrikes on neighborhoods where suspected protesters were sheltering. People began piling into their cars and heading for the northern border of the state. Refugees from Florida began to show up in motels and in makeshift tent camps in the parks and towns in southern Alabama and Georgia, just north of the border. Not knowing what else to do, the governors of Alabama and Georgia sent Red Cross workers to these towns to help with the fleeing people from Florida. But more and more people arrived each week, and it became clear that they would need places to stay. National and international Red Cross assistance poured into Georgia and Alabama, and encampments were set up first at roadside rest areas along Interstate 75 and 95 leading north into Georgia, and eventually near other major highways leaving Florida to the north. By the end of the first year of the Florida crisis, 100,000 Floridians were living in these tent cities, complete with field hospital facilities and makeshift shops and stores. The local people in Alabama and Georgia tried to help as best they could, but the new arrivals were a drain on the resources of these little towns, even though the refugees were also spending some money in the local businesses. Local churches began to take Floridians into the homes of their members, and shelters were set up in public places like fairgrounds, city auditoriums, and parks. But the conflict got worse and worse in Florida. Once he started down the path of crackdowns and violence, Governor Assad of Florida became locked ever tighter in a policy of escalation, knowing that if he ever turned back, the best he could hope for was life in prison as a war criminal, and the more likely outcome was death at the hands of the population he was abusing. His private backers also had no choice but to funnel more and more money to him to help him increase the pay of the remaining National Guard troops and police who still obeyed his orders, and to buy weapons from France, Russia, China, or anyone else who would sell to him. National Guard artillery units began to fire explosive shells into neighborhoods whenever his troops came under fire during patrols around Florida cities. When the state police set up roadblocks on the freeways leading out of the state, the secondary roads became choked with cars pouring north into Georgia and Alabama. Governor Assad didn't have enough manpower to block every little road and track, even though about 6 million Floridians who had run away from their homes ended up hiding out in other towns and cities inside Florida, mostly in North Florida, because they were afraid to go back to their homes. It became clear that a mass exodus was happening. By the end of the fourth year of the crisis, nearly 3 million people from Florida were living in Alabama and Georgia, mostly along the southern border of the states, in those same towns, but only 10% of them could fit into the camps established by the Red Cross. All the rest, nearly 2.5 million people, sometimes outnumbering all the people in the local towns, were living in every motel, hotel, and campground, their rents paid by the federal government. Hundreds of thousands of local residents had taken in temporary lodgers into their homes, sometimes with the rent paid by the Floridians themselves, but in most cases with rent paid with emergency appropriations sent by the U.S. Congress to the states of Georgia and Alabama to provide assistance to the refugees. Refugee Florida children doubled the size of many school classes in the southern parts of these states, while a smaller stream of the refugees fled north to Atlanta, Montgomery, and other states further north. Whole neighborhoods in Atlanta developed into concentrated areas of resettlement by Florida refugees. This refugee population, if gathered together into their own separate towns, would create a string of 10 new Tallahassees spaced all along the southern edges of Georgia and Alabama. This is essentially the situation faced by Turkey today. At the time that Baban, Ilcan, and Rygiel wrote their article in early 2016, there were about 2.7 million Syrian refugees living mostly along the southern border of Turkey. Only 10% of them lived in the camps set up and run by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. The rest had to find places to live, usually with support from the Turkish government, in the local communities to which they had escaped. This new population continued to increase, reaching a total of about 4 million by the end of 2017. About 400,000, or about 1/10 of the number found in Turkey, have managed to escape to other European countries, but most of them remain in countries like Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon or even Iraq, still sheltering near the borders of their home country. The United States has accepted slightly over 20,000 refugees from Syria, or about 1 for every 20 taken in by European countries, or half of 1% of the Syrian refugees still inside Turkey. If you try to put yourself in the shoes of the governors, the legislators, and the local public officials of Alabama and Georgia, faced with these millions of resettled refugees from Florida, you may begin to get an idea of the challenge faced by the Turkish government as the second decade of this new century moves toward its conclusion. What do you do? Your National Guard troops are patrolling the Florida border in Humvees, not to arrest anybody or shoot anybody, but merely to find and register each new Florida resident trying to get out of the state. Your southern towns and cities are overrun with Florida refugees, and sometimes it seems that the federal and even international aid, both monetary and in the form of volunteers and Red Cross staffers, are even increasing the stress on those communities. How do you negotiate with other states further to the north regarding onward settlement of these Floridians to new locations elsewhere? This is a man-made population movement far larger than anything witnessed after Hurricane Katrina or any other natural disaster. What will you do? What is Turkey doing? That is what we find out in this article. In the world today passes laws regulating the conditions for people to cross its borders, and the rights and duties of such people once they're inside the country. As the global system of nation-states has consolidated and become more rigidly controlled by such laws, these legal controls have proliferated and become more explicit over time. In addition, international law holds that treaties signed between countries have equal status with laws passed inside the country, so whenever any country signs such treaties, this adds another layer of regulations and control over the ability of people to move across such national borders. The Second World War left countries around the world battered and disorganized to varying degrees, and also produced a bewildering confusion of displaced people, driven from their homes and often completely out of their countries of origin by the global scale of the conflict. In 1951, the newly formed United Nations organization convened a conference on dealing with these crowds of refugees around the world. Since both the World War and the focus of the new UN centered above all on Europe, the provisions of the resulting Convention on the Status of Refugees was concerned mainly with all the displaced people wandering around in Europe immediately after the war. Most of the countries admitted to the UN signed the 1951 Convention on Refugees, making it one of the controlling legal documents in each of their countries regarding how to deal with such migrants who might come to their own borders. The 1951 Convention specified that if people were fleeing from clear threats to their safety, they must be admitted to any country where they ask for asylum. They also must be treated with certain basic rights. Turkey signed the 1951 Convention, but was one of 4 or 5 countries in the world that exercised a special provision included in one of the paragraphs toward the end of the document, a geographic limitation. Turkey agreed to abide by the international rules of accepting all legitimate refugees who showed up at its borders, but with the interesting restriction that this only applied to people coming from European countries. In other words, since Turkey only had borders with the European countries of Greece, Bulgaria, Russia, and the Ukraine, they would only accept refugees coming from that direction. They did not agree to accept people coming from the other sides of Turkey, from the Middle Eastern countries of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, or any of the countries in the Caucasus region, and grant them official legal recognition as refugees under the terms of the 1951 Convention. This means that all the people who have fled war and violence in Iraq, Syria, and other conflicts in that region can cross into Turkey seeking safety, but they do not become refugees in any formal legal sense. Instead, the Turkish government recognizes them only as temporary guests, the same way we might classify people coming to the United States from other countries as tourists or other temporary visitors. The refugee provisions of the 1951 Convention do not apply to any of these people. These guests began arriving in Turkey almost as soon as the fighting broke out on a massive scale inside Syria in 2011. In just the first year, 100,000 guests showed up for dinner in cities and towns all along Turkey's southern border with Iraq. These guests, for the most part, spoke Arabic, not Turkish, so there was a communication problem right from the start in most cases. The government mobilized Red Cross and Red Crescent aid workers and sent assistance to these temporary visitors, and the United Nations was allowed to set up a string of more than 20 temporary camps near the towns and cities that had been overrun with these Syrian guests. Within the first year or two of the conflict, all of these camps quickly filled up to capacity. Many international non-governmental relief organizations, often referred to as just NGOs, began to build on the basic infrastructure provided by the UN camps and to provide many types of basic services, from health and medical assistance to schools and legal advice. Eventually, there were more than 250,000 Syrian guests visiting in these temporary camps. And after a couple of more years, those with eyes to see began to realize that this was not actually going to be a temporary situation at all. As the violence inside Syria continued to escalate year after year, the flood of people fleeing out of the country across all its borders also continued to grow. While Syrians were displaced in all directions into Lebanon, Jordan, and even Iraq, by far the great majority of them crossed over from the northern regions of Syria into southern Turkey. The UN camps, now administered by the Turkish government, had reached their full capacity and could not take in more of the new arrivals. These people had to wander around looking for abandoned buildings or other places in the ordinary Turkish towns and cities in the region, where they sheltered as best they could while waiting for any kind of assistance from the government. Eventually, this continuing flood of arrivals far outnumbered the early visitors who had settled in the UN camps, so that by the time Baban and his colleagues wrote this article, 9 out of every 10 Syrians living in Turkey had to scramble to find their own shelter and sources of support outside the camps. If they somehow managed to come from Syria with money and other resources, they might be able to find a room or an apartment to rent in a Turkish-owned house. But most of them relied on support provided by the Turkish government, sometimes including paying rent to Turkish households to allow Syrians to come and live with them, or to live in a property that they owned. The severe shortage of housing produced by this influx of people meant that rents rapidly inflated, causing distress not only for Syrians, but for poor Turkish people who needed a place to live. This situation certainly deserves the label that Baban, Ilcan, and Rygiel gives to it. They are interested in what they call precarity, or precariousness, the idea of living on the edge, living with insecurity every day. Where will we sleep? What will we eat? Can the children go to school? What if we get sick? For the answers to all of these questions, the Syrian refugees were totally dependent on the charity of the Turkish government. Since they were not Turkish citizens, and since Turkey had specifically excluded people like them from being considered legally as refugees when they signed the 1951 convention, these guests, who were turning out not to be temporary after all, had no legal rights to anything. No right to look for a job, no right to housing or schooling or medical care or even food. Everything provided to them was considered a gift, charity. The feeling would be similar to what people in the United States might have felt who were displaced from their homes by Hurricane Katrina or other natural disasters. Except for displaced Americans, they were still inside their own country, with all of their fundamental rights as citizens still intact, and within a few months or perhaps years, they would be able to go back and try to restart their lives if they wanted to. They would also be able to look for jobs and apply for other benefits in new locations if they chose that alternative. For the Syrians in Turkey, none of these options were available. They found themselves in a legal limbo, unable to move either forward or back. How long would you last in a situation like that if it were your family that had to run for your lives with nothing but the clothes on your back? Certainly something to think about. The precarious situation in which displaced Syrians find themselves living in Turkey, intense pressure is growing to find some more stable, permanent solution to their problems. This pressure is coming from the Syrians themselves, who must live in the current limbo of uncertainty, and also from the Turkish population surrounding them, who feel the pressures of inflated rents, issues of jobs, and the everyday problems of dealing with new strangers in their midst. When they interact with the Turkish authorities, Syrians in some respects face a paradoxical situation in which they may be afraid to try for one solution to their problems because they worry that anything they do in that direction may close off other alternatives available to them. Baban and his colleagues point out the confusion that exists among the Syrian population and to some extent even among the Turkish and NGO officials who deal with them about what people can and can't do. If you want to seek integration into Turkish society, applying for identity documents and recognition of a more permanent status by the government, does this immediately cancel out your rights to apply for asylum in Sweden or Germany or some other country? If you apply for such resettlement to another country, does this automatically exclude you from consideration for rights and services within Turkey? Some people are convinced that this is the case, while others insist that this is not true, and that you do not give up one set of rights if you seek the other. The reality of this either-or aspect of choices to be made may vary depending on which officials you're talking to, and the legal facts may even change over time. They probably have changed more than once since the authors finished this article. In such a situation, most displaced Syrians are applying for the basic identity document known in Turkey as the kimlik. This card issued by local municipalities includes details about you, such as age and nationality, including Syrian as a category, and can serve as evidence of your eligibility for certain basic rights and services, such as school attendance for children and access to medical care. But as the authors point out in this article, the kimlik is a local document, so that if you move from one city to another, you have to start all over again and reapply for a new card. This discourages people from moving in search of better opportunities and concentrates the problems of dealing with the flood of Syrian arrivals in those southern border regions where they first appeared. The most serious limitation of seeking such integration into Turkish society, though, is that the Kimlik does not convey automatic rights to look for paid employment, particularly for Syrian guests in the country who are not citizens or even refugees. This roadblock means that people with families can't seek legal employment and must rely on government charity, which doesn't go very far either. If they do work for wages, they have to find illegal employers who, of course, exploit them in many ways, including substandard pay and working conditions. Turkey has by far the highest rate of workplace accidents and fatalities of any country in Europe, and a lot of this danger is concentrated in jobs where some of the workers are illegally hired, including Syrian workers. Even if government policy gradually changes to allow legal employment of the Syrians looking for work, this will benefit employers most of all, increasing competition for jobs, driving down wages, and generating a lot of bad feelings among native Turkish workers. Bad feelings that could find unpleasant and destructive outlets eventually. So the prospect of finding some kind of long-term solution of the precarious situation of these displaced Syrians in Turkey does not seem very promising. Of course, the first option that many of the Syrians themselves would prefer is the chance to simply turn around and go home to Syria, to relatives they left behind, if those relatives are still alive, to homes that may not have been blasted flat by the government, to jobs if anybody in Syria would still hire them when they returned. But nobody anywhere is remotely ready to suggest that this is a realistic idea. The internal violence in Syria is still red hot. The communities that many displaced Syrians called home no longer even exist. If this kind of return trip ever becomes possible at all, it is not likely to happen for years or even decades, possibly not within the lifetimes of any of the adults who fled the country. So we can cross that option off our lists. Another possibility is you might, if you have the right connections and good luck, be able to apply for relocation onward to a country somewhere in Europe. Germany has taken in more of the Syrian refugees than any other country outside the immediate circle of those countries directly bordering Syria itself. Every day, a few Syrians now living in Turkey or other places like Greece, Lebanon, or Jordan manage to get through all the paperwork and get a chance to move to Munich or Hamburg or perhaps Stockholm or Vienna or Amsterdam. For the luckiest, most well set up of the Syrians, this remains a real possibility. But it will never be a realistic idea for the millions, literally millions, of other ordinary Syrians who are struggling in the border towns of Turkey just to keep warm in the winter or find something for their children to eat. Europe will never be willing to absorb 4 million Syrians. And of course, we can forget about the United States altogether. Once a leader on the moral world stage and a place that claimed it welcomed the poor, the tired, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, today the American people have put out the torch, held up by the Statue of Liberty, and hung a sign around her neck that says, "Keep your huddled masses." This leaves the third option of integrating 4 million Syrians somehow into the fabric of existing Turkish society. It is not a task that any society could manage well on its own, so it is a good thing that the European Union is funneling a lot of money and other resources to Turkey to help with this process. It is the price they're paying so that Turkey will not just give all the Syrians train tickets into the rest of Europe. We already have seen in other contexts that immigrants have the potential to expand an economy, to create multiplier effects and economic growth if they can find jobs and generate paychecks, which they then spend in other businesses. The theory of the multiplier effect of immigrants sounds good on paper, but as Espenshade and Fry and others have discovered, there's a lot of controversy about how to actually make a thing like that work. Above all, the Syrians trapped inside Turkey today will need the right to work and provide for themselves rather than just accepting handouts from the government forever. But how to get them into the workforce without trashing the working careers of Turkish citizens is not only the most important, but the most challenging mystery facing the Turkish government today. If they can pull it off, it will be a case study for the world of the future. If they can't manage it, the Syrians seem likely to become marginalized and ghettoized into enclaves of despair in the worst neighborhoods all over Turkey, with consequences for generations to come. Cross your fingers and hope for the best.